Near the end of the 1200s, in a monastery in southern Germany, a monk opened a wooden chest and pulled out a flat brown cake he had baked roughly 6 months earlier. It had never been refrigerated or sealed. It had sat in an unheated stone room through the back half of a medieval year. And it was still good, still soft enough to eat, still safe. That cake was Lebkuchen, and the medieval world baked it by the thousands as insurance against the months when nothing else would keep. Now go look at the bread in your own kitchen. It will be mouldy inside a week, and the loaf that lasts longer than that only lasts because a chemical was added to it. The average family throws away well over $1,000 of food a year, and bread sits near the top of that pile. A medieval monk working without a single additive built a cake that beat all of it. This is the story of how he did it. The honey, the spices, the one thing they left out, and how you can still build it yourself today. To understand why a monk would spend a fortune on ingredients on a cake that could survive 6 months, you have to understand what food actually meant in the year 1300. Most of it could not be kept. Medieval Europe ran on a calendar of scarcity. A harvest came in, and from that moment a clock started ticking. Meat spoiled in days unless it was salted or smoked. Milk turned. Fruit rotted. By the late winter and early spring, the stores from the previous year were running thin, and the next harvest was still months away. People called those the hungry months for a reason. And bread, the food that fed the entire continent, was the worst offender of all. A fresh loaf went hard within a day and grew mold within a week. The reason is in the baking itself. Heat turns the starch in the dough into a soft, moist, digestible gel, and that gel is exactly what mold and bacteria want. A fresh loaf is a countdown from the moment it leaves the oven. People had preservation methods, and they used all of them. They salted meat, smoked fish, dried peas, and buried root vegetables in cold earth. But every one of those techniques produced a raw ingredient, not a finished meal. If you were a pilgrim walking 300 miles to a shrine, or a traveller crossing a region with no inn for 2 days, you needed something else. You needed food that was dense with calories, ready to eat the moment you were hungry, and immune to time. The institutions best placed to solve that problem were the monasteries. Monasteries were among the only places in medieval Europe, alongside royal courts, with reliable access to imported spices. They had bees in their own forests, ovens, literate record keepers, and monks with the time to experiment season after season. Somewhere in the monasteries of Franconia, in what is now northern Bavaria, they did exactly that. They built a cake that refused to spoil. The question is how a few simple ingredients managed something our entire modern pantry still struggles to match. The answer is that Lebkuchen was never really a cookie. It was a piece of preservation engineering as deliberate as anything a medieval mason built in stone. And the engineering had 3 parts. The first part, and the foundation under everything else, was honey. Modern Lebkuchen recipes often use sugar. The medieval ones did not, and that single choice is doing more work than it looks. Microbes, the molds and bacteria that rot your food, need water to live. Not water somewhere in the room. Water they can actually pull into their own cells. Food scientists measure this with a number called water activity, on a scale from 0 to 1. Fresh bread sits up around 0.95, which is microbe paradise. Honey sits down near 0.6. At 0.6, almost nothing can grow. Most bacteria simply cannot reproduce below about 0.9, and honey is so starved of free water that it does not just fail to feed microbes. It attacks them. Honey is hygroscopic, which means it pulls moisture toward itself, and when a mold spore lands on a honey-rich surface, the honey draws the water straight back out of it. The spore dries out and dies. None of that is theoretical. It is the reason honey itself is one of the only foods on Earth that essentially never spoils. Archaeologists have opened Egyptian tombs sealed for more than 3,000 years and found pots of honey inside, still soft and still edible. The medieval baker did not need to understand the chemistry to trust the result. He could see it on his own shelf. Build a cake around honey and you borrow some of that same stubborn refusal to rot. And the idea was old even when he had it. The Egyptians baked honey cakes. The Romans had their own, a flat honeyed bread they called panis mellitus. For thousands of years across the ancient world, honey was simply how you made food defy time. So the medieval baker's base ingredient was not a sweetener that happened to preserve. It was a preservative that happened to be sweet. And there was a second reason to reach for honey instead of sugar. Cane sugar in the 1300s was an import from India and Persia, so rare it was called white gold, locked away for the wealthy. Honey came from the forest behind the monastery. The better preservative was also the only one a monk could actually afford. Honey starves the microbes of water, but on its own, it does not get you to 6 months. The next part of the system was the part kept under lock and key. For most of its early history, Lebkuchen was not even called Lebkuchen. It was called Pfefferkuchen, pepper cake. That name is a clue. Read an early recipe and you find a startling load of spice. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, cardamom, anise, to a modern eye that reads as flavour or as festive warmth. In the 1300s it read as raw money. These spices travelled overland and by sea from India, Sri Lanka and the islands of Indonesia through a long chain of middlemen that ended in the warehouses of Venice. By the time they reached a German kitchen, a single pound of certain spices could cost a working labourer weeks of wages. Loading a cake with this much spice was a display of wealth most households on the continent could never make. Pepper in particular was treated less like a seasoning and more like currency. It was counted out 1 corn at a time, written into rents, folded into dowries, and accepted in place of coin. To bake with a free hand of spice was, quite literally, to bake with your savings. But the spices were not only there to flavour the cake or to flaunt a monastery's budget. They were the second hurdle. Cinnamon and clove in particular are not passive ingredients. They contain compounds, concentrated in their natural oils, that actively inhibit the growth of mould and bacteria. This is not medieval folklore. Modern food laboratories still test clove oil and cinnamon oil as genuine antimicrobials, and they work. So the medieval baker had stacked 2 defences. The honey emptied the cake of usable water. The spices laced what little remained with compounds that poisoned anything trying to grow there. A mould spore landing on a finished Lebkuchen met a dry, hostile, chemically defended surface. And then the baker did something cleverer than adding anything at all. The third part of the system was about what got left out. Open a modern cookie or cake, and the ingredient quietly doing the damage is fat. Butter, shortening, oil. Fat is what makes a cake tender, and fat is also a spoilage clock. Over weeks and months, fats oxidize. They go rancid. A rich, buttery cake carries the seeds of its own decay, built right into the recipe. The keeping versions of medieval Lebkuchen were lean. Honey, flour or ground breadcrumbs, nuts, eggs in some recipes, and a heavy dose of spice. Little or no added fat. The baker had removed an entire pathway to spoilage simply by never opening that door. What fat usually provides is softness, and honey covered for that. The same hygroscopic pull that kills microbes also holds the cake at a steady, slightly moist texture for months, without ever offering up water a microbe could actually use. A lean honey cake does not dry into a rock. It just sits there, stable. The structure helped too. Lebkuchen was baked dense, with very little air worked into it, which gave mould less surface to colonize. Many were baked onto a thin wafer, an oblate, the same wafers the monasteries pressed for communion. And the finished cake was often sealed under a hard glaze, a final skin between the food and the air. 3 parts: honey, spice, a lean and sealed body. Each one on its own is modest. Stacked together, they did something that modern science would not have a name for until the 1970s. This is where the story stops being history and starts being science. For most of human history, food preservation looked like a single decisive act. You salted the meat, you dried the fish. One method, one barrier, and you hoped it held. Lebkuchen did not work like that, and for centuries nobody could quite explain why it worked as well as it did. In the 1970s, a German food microbiologist named Lothar Leistner finally put a name to it. He called it hurdle technology. The idea is simple, and once you see it, it is hard to unsee. A microbe trying to spoil your food is like a runner facing a row of hurdles. Make one hurdle very high, a single extreme barrier, and a tough enough microbe can still clear it. But set up several modest hurdles in a row, and nothing makes it to the finish line. Each one is survivable on its own. The combination is not. That is precisely what a Lebkuchen is. Low water activity from the honey, antimicrobial compounds from the spice, a lean, dense, sealed body with no fat to go rancid and little air for mould to take hold in. 3 hurdles. No single one of them is extreme. A microbe could clear any one of them alone. It cannot clear all 3. Food scientists even have a category for what the medieval baker accidentally invented. They call it an intermediate moisture food, a product moist enough to eat straight out of the chest, but too dry to rot. Lebkuchen is a textbook example. The textbook just arrived about 700 years late. And it is not some rare trick. Once you know the principle, you start seeing it everywhere. It is why a hard salami survives for months in a pantry, why a jar of jam outlasts the fruit it was made from, why a cured ham can hang for a year and only get better. Every one of them quietly stacks the same kind of hurdles. The medieval baker simply got there first and folded the whole idea into something you could carry in a bag and eat with one hand. Here is what should land differently. That system never actually disappeared. The recipe survived, and you can build the medieval version of it in your own kitchen this week. It is not difficult. It mostly asks you for one thing the modern world is bad at giving, and we will come back to that. Start with the honey, because the honey is the engine. You warm it gently in a pot until it loosens and thins. You do not boil it hard. Into that warm honey go the spices, with a far heavier hand than a modern recipe would dare. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, cardamom, and a little black pepper if you want the old name to mean something. Then ground nuts or fine breadcrumbs, eggs and flour, worked in until the mixture pulls together into a stiff, dark, dense dough. Notice what is missing. No butter, no oil. You are building it lean on purpose, because lean is what lasts. For the lift, the traditional German recipes use 2 old leaveners with strange names, potash and baker's ammonia, potash, and Hirschhornsalz. They predate baking soda by centuries, and they give Lebkuchen its particular chewy, slightly open crumb. If you cannot track them down, ordinary baking soda will stand in well enough. Now the part the modern world is bad at. You do not bake the dough, you rest it. You wrap it, put it somewhere cool, and you walk away. Traditionally, this rest ran for weeks, and the serious German bakeries still mix the dough for next Christmas in January, almost a year early, and simply let it sit. The wait is not superstition. As the dough matures, the spices mellow and marry, the texture deepens, and the flavour turns from sharp and raw to round and warm. Even a few days changes it noticeably. A few weeks transforms it. The patience is an ingredient, and it is the one ingredient you cannot buy. When you finally bake, you bake it dense and you bake it modest. Rolled out a finger thick or spread onto thin wafers the way the monasteries used their communion oblaten in a moderate oven just until the tops are dry and set. You are not making a fluffy cake. You are making a dense block of preserved calories, and that is the entire point. If you want to do it the way the old workshops did, this is where the carved wooden mould comes in. A block of pear wood cut with a deep relief, a saint, a heraldic animal, a coat of arms, pressed hard into the dough so the picture baked in and held its edges. It was decoration. It was also a signature, a way of marking a cake that might travel for months before anyone broke it open. Last, you seal it. A thin sugar glaze brushed over the top while it is still warm, or a coat of chocolate once it has fully cooled. That hard skin is the final hurdle, the barrier between the food and the air. Then you put it in a tin and you leave it alone. And here is the quiet proof of everything this video has said. It will not just survive in that tin for months, it will improve. The slow aging that turns a modern cookie stale and rancid is the exact same process that makes a Lebkuchen worth eating. Which brings us back to the bread in your kitchen. Modern bread can stay soft for 3 weeks. It manages that with help. The supermarket loaf is dosed, usually with a mold inhibitor called calcium propionate, listed on European labels as E282. We never out-engineered the medieval baker. We just reached the same finish line by a different route, and we hid the cost of it in small print on a label and inside a body that has to process it. And we still throw the food away anyway. In some countries, close to a third of the bread that gets baked is never eaten. The average family bins well over $1,000 of food a year. We solved shelf life and wasted the food regardless. The medieval monk had no preservatives, no refrigeration, and no chemistry to lean on. He had honey, pepper, a hot oven, and the patience to stack 3 quiet defences on top of each other until time itself ran out of moves. 6 months, out of a cake. We struggled to get 3 honest weeks out of a loaf. We never lost the recipe. You could bake it this week, and now you know how. What the modern world lost was the knowledge of what it actually was. A piece of food engineering so quietly good that it outlived the problem it was built to solve. If this changed how you look at the cookie tin, hit that like button and subscribe. We dig up forgotten knowledge the modern world left behind. Not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them solved problems we have completely forgotten how to solve. Subscribe, and let's keep investigating.